at the time when Ofsted, in their latest framework from September 2019, were talking about the quality of education and how this was going to be a key driver for making judgments about the quality of provision in schools. But I've been working on it for about 18 months. So it really was just coincidence. And in fact, I'd been at a conference in Bath, and I was talking to Sir Tim Oates about whether who led, as we know, on the review of the national curriculum, which came out in 2013 for implementation in 2014. And I said, Tim, is there a book that draws together everything that's happened in relation to the national curriculum and just synthesizes it all? And anyway, he couldn't think of one. So after I'd done my session, at the end of it, I just said to the assembled conference, there are about 300 people there, does anyone know of a book that's done this? And no hands went up. And so I realized then that I needed to write one. It wasn't really for the sector. It was really just to get my own thinking straight. So it's just been
the
really
byproduct
really,
almost is the. So you strike me as a very a very cerebral person. I talk to a lot of people who have lots of good ideas. I talk to people and listen to people who've got lots of good vision, but you seem to have a way of combining both. You seem to be able to, well, as I said, capture the mood, but have a kind of a vision, but also kind of be very pragmatic and kind of analytical around what teachers need, and it's just going a little bit deeper, I suppose. That's what it strikes me as. Can I ask you, in terms of the last sort of couple of years, I suppose, have you noticed, because if you look at National Curriculum 2013, there's been a lot of flux with Ofsted. Have things settled down the last couple of years, would you say, in education, or did they not need settling down in the first place? Or what would you say your observations have been?
I think we've got much greater clarity about what constitutes reasonable practice. I don't like, I worry about good practice or best practice, particularly best practice, because it implies that there is a gold standard for anything. And we just know that all evidence is actually provisional. And so we have to be very pragmatic about what we're doing in schools and why we're doing it. But I think we have got a lot more evidence-informed conversations going on about what really makes a difference to children's learning. And I think that's been healthy, because the byproduct of that has been the dealing with a lot of misconceptions about what good practice is in terms of having an impact on children's learning. And I think it was very helpful when Ofsted a few years ago did their myth-busting document. Sad to say that some of those myths still persist, but I do think that is getting better.
So what are these myths? What are these perceptions? And if people are hearing those kinds of things in schools, how might they approach those or tackle those? Should they just listen to them and say, oh, okay, or should they be challenging those things?
Well, yes, they should be challenging them. So I'll give you an example. I think of one of the biggest myths that needed to be nailed head on, and it was great when this was done, and that is in relation to marking and feedback. So the inspectorate made it really clear that they do not expect to see any quantity of marking in children's books.
Right.
And I just think that was really helpful, because I think the sector, large parts of the sector, had got stuck on this notion that teachers were not doing their jobs properly if children's books weren't marked.
Everyone went marking crazy. I remember a time when people just went absolutely bonkers, mark, and grids, and people were petrified of marking, setting homework every day, and it was a big thing.
Well, and you could see how it came about. So when less helpful practice becomes embedded, it's never a blame game. You can see how it led up to that, and that was because years previously, there'd been a number of school inspection reports which had praised the quality of feedback in children's books, because the people looking at the books could see that the children's work had improved. But it's that second bit that had got dropped off. So a lot of people read that and said, we just need to mark the books. Yeah, but the question is, have the children improved? And so stripping that back, I think, has been helpful, because one of the threads of that's just one example in terms of the marking frenzy, is that we've sometimes got confused with process equaling the end product.
Right.
So there's sometimes an assumption, because I do this, therefore that is going to happen.
Sure.
So because the books have been marked, therefore children have improved.
Yes. And how do you tackle that? Whether you're a teacher or you're a leader, because that still exists. That's still there, I think, not just in teaching, but in most walks of life, but certainly in teaching. And then actually I've noticed that the more technology's creeped in and people start to use video tech and such, like, there's a tendency to sort of think, as long as I get everything done, as long as I deliver everything, and I become, I throw everything down the lens on a PowerPoint, and then I've done my bit. How do you tackle this notion that you still got to look at whether people have improved or learned something at the end, or as they go?
So I think there are two aspects of that. One is this notion that I've done something. So I might have taught it, but have my children got it? So and linked to that is what I call the curse of content coverage. So there is this idea that I've got, I've just got to get through the content. I've got to get through the content. There's no copyright on good ideas. So, because the children have had the content, but have they digested it, and have they produced something as a result of it? So it's that stepping back and saying, did they need all that? Did they need more? And so there's that. But then the second aspect to your observation is something I think has also muddied the water, is how do I know what's the impact of what I've done? So this again is,
how do you measure it?
Well, measure is problematic. What we're measuring against.
Of course,
And so the what has sometimes been a stumbling block is teachers being expected to show impact on what I consider to be false proxies. So things like, and I still get people in touch with me saying, I need to show progress in my lessons every 10 minutes. And so what should I do? And so I reply, so I've got no idea. I said,
no golden bullet for that one.
Why don't you ask the person who is expecting this of you to demonstrate what that looks like, and then you'll know. Because it doesn't exist. Learning is not linear. So we've got issues like that. We've then got issues about, having to show impact against flight paths, completely distorts provision as well. So it's a very complex thing that we need to be unpicking at every stage, not to make a huge burden for ourselves or the people we're working with, but actually to say, if we're doing this, what impact is it likely to have on my pupils and students' learning? And I might not know immediately, but that's all right. I'm just going to go through that process and then make some judgments. But this idea, just because I do something means that it's going to happen. That's why we've got to be continually regulating the whole time.
There's a lot of language in education that sort of, even the word impact, they're not always clearly defined, but they're used in a particular context. So measure is one example of that. Measuring progress was always a huge thing. Do you feel that the language is important that we use, and we should be using a more shared approach to language, or should we just be more careful about explaining terms when we're using them?
I think it's important to explain terms when we use them, and I'm a great believer in just trying to simplify the whole time. What's the purest form most elegant form and simplest form in order to be able to get to the heart of the matter. And so, yeah, I just think keep things simple. What do I want my children to learn? What am I going to do? And how will I know?
Sure.
And I do think the latest framework's been helpful in this, actually. So, just to tip back into the measurement thing for a moment. I mean, there are measures of children's standards at the end of key stage 1, 2, 4, and 5, and those are against standards nationally, and I think that's entirely legitimate. But what we've got to be careful of is that we don't translate those indicators of achievement against, or attainment even, against what is happening in the intervening years. And I think that's distorted a lot of practice. So you'll get, for instance, sometimes in year 7, I come across examples where, in order for children to perform well in an English paper 5 years later, they're given exam questions based on the year 11 paper, and graded accordingly. So it's that sort of thing that starts really distorting practice. We want our children to do well after 5 years. They've got to have a really rich offer, which is given to them, and we make some judgments about whether they have got it or not through all sorts of different indicators. I actually think the simplest one is talking to them, having a look at their books, and just saying, I've taught this. Have we actually covered this bit of the content? But to start then layering it in secondary with GCSE exam levels in year 7 usually limits what is then offered to children. So we just kind of got to give them the best we can, and then get them to take the exam at the end.
Yeah, there's a lot of talk at the moment about what the world needs and what young people need. How much are we trying to take our children down this very academic route, compared with more of the play and exploration and finding out, but through practical means, practical subjects, physical education, PSHE?
Well, I don't think there's a clash between children knowing things and children doing things within those more practical domains. I think still pitch to the top. Why would I not want to pitch to the top? So all the evidence is that children like doing interesting things. They like knowing interesting stuff. So I don't see the academics on the one hand, I mean, and the more hands-on aspects as being in contrast. What I do think is another strand within that, though, is this idea that children explore and find things out for themselves. I think that's a waste of time in schools, if I'm honest. They can do that. They can do that at home. There's too many opportunities for, frankly, mucking about. So, but what we can do,
it's almost as if you were a fly on the wall in my classes when I was young. But it's very true. It's absolutely true.
And how can I explore something and find out stuff for myself if I haven't got a base of knowledge from which to explore that? So children need to know something before they can then take it further. I just so I'm not saying they never explore, but we're not going to spend time on the internet googling things in my lesson. I haven't got time.
Sure. No,
so I might, I think that's where extended projects and can be great, but actually that's something that children do over time as part of the ongoing work that we're doing, that leads up to a final piece of work, which can then be done for an audience, either other children in the class or for governors or a display or whatever. So I'm all for ownership, children having ownership of the outcomes of their work. But, if we go back to how children learn before they go to school, they're highly imitative of the adults around them. They want to get involved in what adults are doing, if someone is peeling some potatoes, they want to get involved in that. So why would we deny our young people the stuff that is important in the adult world? And I would include in that knowing stuff, whether it's in the academic domain or in the more hands-on domain. There is equal amounts of rigor, I would argue, in both.
Sure. That's a really interesting point, actually, about rigor, because, the perception could very easily be that kind of the practical hands-on, the sport and the PE and such like, and the music, and isn't necessarily as rigorous as the class. But I think what I'm picking up is this, there are similarities, there's an interrelationship, there's an interlocking of the two, potentially there's not a hierarchy there. And actually we know also that through some of the practical subjects, there's a lot of academic rigor that goes with it, and a lot of knowledge learning as well.
Yes, sure. So, the new book is back on track, and it's out 15th of September. I'd started writing it earlier on in the year, and then I found I was traveling far less when lockdown started, so that created the space to be able to complete it. But the thrust of the message and the thread that I was working through before lockdown remained the same even during lockdown. And, that at the heart of what I'm trying to do in that is to draw on some of the wider thinking and literature around keeping the main thing the main thing. So I'm drawing on Greg McCann's essentialism, only working on the things that are moving us forward in what we value most. I'm also drawing on the Pareto rule, the 80-20 rule.
Right.
Very interesting background to that. Pareto was an Italian professor working at University in Geneva, and he was actually researching, this is the 1890s or so, he was researching land use in England. And his observation was that 80% of the land in England was owned by 20% of the people at the time. And what subsequently happened, that 80-20, he realized that it might have implications for other aspects of human society, but it's been picked up and used consistently in a number of leadership and management thinking, is that by and large, 80% of the output comes from about 20% of the input.
Right.
Now, it's not hard and fast, but what I wanted to do was try and relate that to education. And when we look through that lens, we then say, well, is differentiating half a dozen ways going to make that amount of difference when we know that there are other more productive ways? Is submitting forms in triplicate in terms of my planning? This is particularly an issue in some primary schools. The best use of time. I'm not saying we don't plan, we do need plans, but actually there's a lot of redundant paperwork. And so it's just a lens through which to look at everything, including how we hold ourselves to account in terms of performance appraisal processes as well. So I've just looked at a number of different processes. And then I've linked it through to how, what our school values are, and what we know is, from a lot of evidence, is likely to have the greatest impact for the greatest number of children, and that's the quality of curriculum.
Interesting.
So in order to get to the quality of curriculum, because we can't just keep loading more and more onto ourselves and our colleagues, what are we going to strip out? And so that is the thread of what this is about. And then a second thread, and I also had this in Gallimaufry as well, is going back to first sources in any kind of planning that we do, because there's an awful lot of degradation of material which is landing on children's desks. Some of it is simply not good enough. And so we need to be going back to high quality original sources where possible in order to really sharpen our minds on the curriculum. Now, the paradox in all this is that in doing this work, it's actually less work for teachers. So there are big gains en route if we work through this systematically.
Yeah, it's amazing to think actually that what you seem to be bringing together is, apart from kind of the mood of the profession, the reality of the profession at the moment, and the need for the profession to do exactly that. And I really like the subtitle, fewer things in greater depth. That really resonates, I think, with a lot of people. So what a lot of people will have been saying for a long time, but it's probably not been articulated in one place in a book in quite this way, particularly drawing on these kinds of models and evidence. In terms of this whole, because I'll give you one anecdote that probably frames my next question. I remember when specialist status schools were around, and we were a sports college, and the whole focus was on the 10 high quality points that we had to deliver in PE. So I was a PE teacher, and it was a fascinating time because it had huge amounts of credibility, and we were constantly looking for quality. Then as time went by, we got a bit greedy, I think. And the Youth Sport Trust, who led this, was an absolutely fantastic organisation, but under a lot of pressure to go from this 2 hours a week high quality with these 10 points to 5 hours a week. And my view, and I know a number of colleagues felt that when you went to 5 hours a week, the whole thing just dumbed down and spread out, and you know, we were finding really that the children were benefiting more from 2 hours of high quality than 5 hours of poor quality. So a quantity over quality thing, and I think that's probably happened a number of times in the profession. But now more than ever, with challenges around the globe that we have, is probably the time that you just can't do anything but do fewer things in greater depth. So my question really is, what should those things be?
Right. Well, that is an absolutely legitimate observation. So the baseline is safeguarding. That's absolutely non-negotiable. But beyond that, what is going to make most difference to most children? And people might debate that. But I'm arguing, and there's plenty of evidence to support my argument, but I'm always happy to have it critiqued, is that it's the quality of the curriculum. And so if we then take the next step from that, then leaders need to be asking themselves, are we creating time for those who are developing the curriculum, which is basically everyone who's teaching, to make sure that what they are giving the children is the best quality? So the fewer things in greater depth then bleeds into things like, well, how are we using our staff meetings or departmental meetings in secondary? Are they focused on what is going to be taught, or are they overladen with admin, which frankly could be dealt with in an email? So what this starts doing is it starts either encouraging us or forces us to say, well, how are we going to use this time? Now, a lovely example from a few months or so ago, that there was a primary head teacher who was concerned that his staff did not have a sufficiently wide knowledge of children's literature beyond a diet of dal.
Right, okay.
And so started using the staff meetings, and this is how he kicked it off. Staff came in as normal for their weekly staff meeting, and on the staff room table, a pile of books, reading books. And he just said to them, pick up one of these, any that grabs your fancy, go and spend the next 3/4 of an hour skimming this, beginning to read it, then come back and we'll spend the last 15 minutes with the headlines of what we've learned from that.
Sure.
Now, what he found was actually all of them wanted to take them home.
Right.
That wasn't the intention.
Sure.
That wasn't the intention. But that to me is an example of someone who shifted their focus into, well, what's the need here? What can be done really efficiently to address that? So
and
what we know is
that,
and what we know is that if people are offered interesting stuff, whether it's adults or children, they're intrigued by it, they want to go and do more. It starts creating more intellectual energy. And I know of another school who did something similar, but they didn't have enough books for the TAs.
Right.
There was practically a riot. They were so cross, I had to go get some more books.
Yeah.
So big messages there. And then if you think about that in secondary, so, lots of schools, so like Sean Allison's school, Durrington Research School, and others as well doing this, that, they use their departmental or faculty meetings very focused on the content that is going to be taught to pupils and students over that next week, addressing some of the misconceptions.
Sure.
But sitting behind this is work on what a sequenced curriculum looks like that makes sense across a key stage or across a number of key stages, 1 and 2 in primary and 3 and into 4 in secondary. So then the question is, how do we make the time to do that? And I'm arguing it needs to be stripped out of the stuff that's not adding value. And there's a long list of those who are in my.
What would be your top of your list? What because you mentioned admin once or twice. I mean, that's a perennial issue, isn't it? I'm not sure. I know there's been a push from Ofsted to try to curtail admin, but again, people perhaps always feel that there's something tangible about admin. I remember days where we'd have to write everything down and because you're almost paranoid, you have to show something physically, and I think that transcends across a lot of professions and organisations. But what's on your top hit list, Mary, for things that really you see that just should be just taken out?
I've already mentioned marking, data collection.
And so actually, can I pause you on that then? So if we take out marking, what do you replace it with?
You replace it with strategies like whole class feedback. Right. So you've just got a summary sheet for that class, and you're just gathering evidence during the lesson of who is getting it, who is struggling, what some of the misconceptions are, and basic errors like spelling mistakes. So that's partly in the lesson, partly where appropriate, skimming some of the books, doesn't have to be all of them, and annotating that sheet. Now we know that has greater impact when that happens, both in primary and secondary. So
it does seem to resonate a little bit with you talked before about the 80-20, this notion that actually, if you're going book to book to book to book and you're correcting the same kind of thing, but actually as a collective, there's probably a number of common threads. Would that be right?
Yeah. But also, if I've identified something in more than one child's book, why am I writing it down again? I mean, there's just so many problems with written marking. I'm not saying we never mark, but why are we marking? And I'm arguing it should be towards the end of a substantive piece of work, because the rest of it should be live in the classroom, and modelling through visualisers what's working well and what might need to be adjusted. But I just do the headlines of what's wrong with most marking. So first of all, it's a proxy for activity. It shows the teacher's done something. But quite often, it's something like, well done. Well,
yeah, of course, yeah.
And then if you get
not in my case, but yeah.
Then when you get into, you've got to provide an even better if. So then the teacher, quite often, not always, but there's a lot of this going on. Well, in primary, it'd be something like, you need to use more wow words. Right. Or in secondary, you need to give more explanations in your answer. The child is going to be thinking, if I knew more wow words, I would have used them the first time, Mrs. Myatt.
Right. Yeah, sure.
If I knew more explanations, I'd have used them.
Yeah, yeah.
It's really not helpful. And then I tell you what really breaks my heart is I'll be looking at a book and a teacher's written a mini essay, actually is helpful. But then the child's just written, cheers, miss. I mean,
Yeah.
it could have been down the pub. This is, this wasted time. We've got to hold ourselves to account for.
Yeah.
Now, I'm not suggesting this to cut corners. I'm suggesting things like whole class feedback, for which there is a lot of evidence. Is it much better for the children? That's why we do it. All right. Not, oh, by the way, it saves teachers time, but it's that way round. Our teacher is much more purposeful the next lesson if we've done things like whole class feedback. But this is a classic example of where I've done something to prove that it's happened. And so, it is an absolute proxy for actually what is really happening in terms of children's learning.
And how do you, again, it's an age-old question really, but formative assessment, ongoing assessment, whatever you want to call it, what advice have you got for teachers and head teachers who've perhaps fall into what might be called a trap of thinking that you have to keep recording everything and you have to keep marking everything because you have to show that evidence trail? And what advice would you give to them? Because it's a very natural instinct to try to do that and to otherwise it can feel like you're teaching something and you might have got a response back, but that's just sort of disappeared into the ether, because you've got no evidence of what they've done that in that one moment, if you like. Does that make sense?
So my question is, who's the evidence for? If I've got a senior leader coming into my classroom and they can't work out what's going on, or an inspector, I've got questions about whether they can do the job. Why have I got to produce evidence for another professional? Yeah, I think we've got to have some of these quite tough questions bounce back.
They are good challenges. They are tough challenges.
My only obligation, my only audience are the pupils and students in front of me. And so, because you say that a child has given a response in the moment and it's gone into the ether. It's also gone into their thinking.
Yes.
So when you talk about, this is where we get our priorities distorted. It's gone into the ether because a senior leader, my line manager, wasn't watching it. It's not gone into the ether as far as the child is concerned. So again, it's about getting our priorities right. So when you talk about formative assessment, these are ongoing conversations with children live in the classroom about what they've learned, how we know they've learned it, what misconceptions there are, and what they're going to do as a result of what they might not have understood.
Sure.
Okay. Yeah. And it's that bit, as I mentioned earlier, that last bit, what are they going to do differently, that is missing in lots of all this proxy activity quite often.
I do believe, actually, to some degree, is we all get a little bit stuck in our ways, and to some extent, some people, that's always going to be a comfort blanket for them, whether it's marking or data. But new teachers coming in, or teachers who are very experienced but still wanting to make that change, what do we do about that?
Well, I think it's quite useful to look at the latest education inspection framework from Ofsted. Now, it's really important we don't run our schools for Ofsted, we run them for our pupils and students. But we would be unwise not to take account of, what is in the framework. And I think it's very interesting that the inspectorate say that they're not going to look at any internally generated school data. So we have to ask why. Why are they not looking at internally generated school data? Because they know that those numbers or levels, well, they shouldn't be using levels, but still lots of level stuff going on, particularly in primaries, is that it's not been moderated across hundreds of thousands of other children. It's not been benchmarked in the way that year 6 SATs, GCSE, BTECs and A-levels have been. So that's one issue. The second issue is that you know, they're neither valid nor reliable. What are they representing? Okay, so they're going to mean something different in every setting. So that is one aspect of it. So what are inspectors doing instead? They're talking to children about what they've been learning. They're looking at their books to see if there's this sense of children cumulatively learning more and being able to do more over time. And then they're having a look at, you know, what was intended. They're having a look at the overall curriculum. Is this what was meant to happen? You know?
Yeah.
And they're making some judgments. So basically, the curriculum is the progression model. I think that's really helpful. So instead of all these pseudo numbers, it's now I've taught it. Have they got it? How do I know? So to put that to one side, because you know, my line manager and senior leaders still need to know as to whether my children are getting on. Right. So it's a question then in schools for how that information is gathered. And I find it really interesting that, you know, even several years ago, the inspectorate were talking about data is one element within information. We want information about how well children are going on. And that is entirely legitimate. But don't tell me that a number is going to give a senior leader that information. So it needs to be far more nuanced. And I'm actually working on a quadrant at the moment where within each of the quadrants you would have, you'd be placing the names of certain children. And so one would be relating to effort, and then another would be relating to the extent to which children had got it. And you'd want children to be up in the top right quadrant where they put a great deal of effort in and you've got evidence that they had got it.
Gotcha.
Then, and this is what some schools are doing, you've got a conversation. Then I would then be having a conversation with my line manager, talking to me about how my class was getting on. And we'd just be taking some samples of children across the profiles. So there might be a child who, you know, hadn't been doing so well last time, you know, was underperforming. You might have a child who had pupil premium funding, but and also high prior attainment. Just take some of those samples, talk through where they were on that quadrant, or where they are on that quadrant, with examples of their work. If my line manager then agrees that that is broadly where they are, that then kind of then be signed off for the rest of the class, and then that is aggregated, you know, and so that you've then got something that you can share with governors or trustees.
So there's a sort of a congruence to it all, but you've got these separate areas, but it all kind of hangs together.
And so we take a little bit of information to tell a big story. And that is completely opposite of, you know, some of the horrors that I've come across in my work of internally generated school data. So there was one example where I was on an inspection. I asked to see, well, I just asked how the year 9s were getting on. And so I was given a sheet, rag rated, with the students' names and the different subjects. Absolutely fine. But I noticed that the ICT, as it was then, it was still ICT in those days, at the end of year 9, all the students were green, which meant that they were at least at expected standards. I said, well, tell me what's happening then in the next 2 years, because I'd also noticed that ICT was the worst performing subject in the school. So I said to the head, you know, what's happened here? I said, because they're doing really well according to the sheet at the end of year 9. By the end of year 9, and he looked at me and said, oh, I see what you mean, Mary. Now, it shouldn't have taken me to go in and see that. Now, it didn't affect the judgment of the school. It was still a good school. And we had a laugh about it. But it's this kind of nonsense. It doesn't get interrogated.
Yeah. And actually then to produce it requires interrogation, which takes time. And I'm sure that's a whole kind of rabbit hole in itself that that you can end up going in and arguing about the sort of semantics and the you know, what the data means and such like, perhaps is also lost time, lost energies in a way. Well, look, you continue to innovate, Mary. That word is heavily overused, but not in your context. We are always grateful to hear from you. You always bring something unique, and from that first book in 2016 to now, I think you have become definitely a household name in the teaching world. So fascinating and useful. So thank you so much.
Absolute pleasure. Thanks so much for asking me, Rob.
Brilliant. Thank you. Take care for now.